Somebody in a black Lincoln town car, limousine type car, tried to run me off the road. Not only did they try to run me off the road, they tried to do it twice. I escaped them by taking my motorcycle and riding through the desert. The second occurrence occurred when I was visiting friends. That lady right there. I was at their house overnight, and her husband Frank took me home, and we found that my apartment had been firebombed. Alan Benz of APRO has a copy of the fire report that shows that it was arson.
In June of 1977, Bill English claims to have been shown a top-secret government document dealing with UFOs, aliens, abductions, and experimentation on human beings. Shortly after viewing the document, he went underground and was not heard from for years. Since re-emerging in late 1988, English has told a frightening tale of harassment by the government and even claims that several attempts were made on his life. The following interview of English was taped on August 30th, 1990 at the Roadway Inn in Tucson, Arizona, and was conducted by Jim Spicer. Following the interview is a presentation made by Bill English the next day, his first official public speaking engagement since coming forward with this controversial story. Shining Star Productions makes no warranties as to the veracity of the information you are about to hear. We merely present it as one person's perspective on the UFO enigma.
I think the best way to do this, Bill, is to probably do it in chronological order. Maybe go back to the B-52 incident. Okay, now you were in Special Forces Vietnam.
I was in Special Forces Vietnam. I was part of the 8th Special Forces unit that was attached to 5th Special Forces Special Operations in Vietnam.
Okay. Along comes an incident where you are dispatched to the site of a B-52 crash, or some kind of a landing involving a B-52.
Well, initially we were told that we had to go into the jungle to recover a downed aircraft, which was pretty standard. The aircraft had crashed in Laos. At the time, we weren't really aware of what the circumstances were, other than the fact it had been downed. It wasn't until several years later that I discovered what the details were concerning the B-52 and how it came to be in the jungle. But we received our orders from MACV headquarters in Saigon, which essentially said go in, recover flight recorders, any survivors if there were any, and bring them back out. So we crossed over into the border of Laos, and it took us about 3 or 4 days to get there, and we found the aircraft at the coordinates which had been given us. Apparently they had been able to pinpoint its location by its locator beacon. And when we got there, initially what we found was pretty unusual, and we didn't really give it much credence or thought at that point until we started looking around. And what we found was the B-52 was completely intact. There was no visible damage. There was no cut through the jungle that looked any of that kind of stuff. And the only damage that we saw to the aircraft was where the aircraft was sitting on the underside of the fuselage. And that was from the pressure of the aircraft sitting there. The aircraft had a full load of bombs, a full load of fuel in it. And we took a very big chance in blowing one of the hatches open. And when we went into the aircraft, what we discovered was the crew, the entire crew, were still in their safety seats, still in their harnesses, and they were all dead.
Mutilated how?
We didn't know it at the time, but they were mutilated in what we now refer to as the classic sense of the word. Eyes were missing. Sections of their faces were skinned completely away, and the bone was cleaned like white. It was white bone. Teeth, sections of the neck and throat all the way down to the esophagus. Their tongues had been removed.
So basically reminiscent of the
cattle mutilations, right. And there was no blood. And usually in a situation like that, you would expect to see blood all over the place. And in confined quarters like that, you would expect to be slipping and sliding in it. Well, we weren't any. The very fact that there wasn't any was remarkable to us. So after we spent about an hour looking through the ship, collecting dog tags and taking photographs of everything. We pulled the flight recorder out of the aircraft, and we sealed the plane and filled it with explosive charges. More of it. I left Vietnam in 1971 after a 2-year tour of duty there, and was sent to Germany and all. And by this time I had married, and my wife at that point was. So we took a transfer to England, where she was assigned to the dependent schools at RAF Chicksands, which is an Air Force Security Services command base, a big air listening base.
Right, so you're a civilian by this time?
I'm a civilian by this time.
Okay.
And I guess we'd been at Chicksands for a month, and I was at the officers club one day, and I happened to meet an old commanding officer of mine from my Army days. He had retired from the Army several years before with the government, and I said, sure, I'd love to. And so he set it up with the interviews and everything, and I got hired by Air Force Security Services Command as a data analyst. And I was assigned to the analysis section of Air Force Security Services Command at Chicksands, and my job essentially was to analyze information and material that came through the Big Ear site. And the job itself was pretty standard, pretty normal, as normal as you can get in circumstances like that. And I worked at it for close to 3 years before I came into my office one day and was asked to analyze a document called Grudge Blue Book Report number 13.
Okay, let me stop you right there. This is July 1977.
July 27th, 1977.
This is the day that the alleged Grudge Blue Book Project Special Report 13 crossed your desk. Let me straighten out on that one point.
Mm-hmm.
There's some contention as to whether it was Grudge or Blue Book that was responsible for this particular special report. Was it Grudge or Blue Book?
I believe it was Blue Book, but I believe it was a mistake on their part. Mm-hmm. The document was entitled Grudge/Blue Book Report 13. Now, the government for close to 40 years has denied the existence of Blue Book Report 13, giving all kinds of screwball explanations as regards to why, and one of the most predominant is, well, because it was number 13, and 13's an unlucky number, and I've never known the government to pay any kind of attention to that kind of thing ever.
What I had heard was that they had started on 13 and got a whole bunch of new material that brought it in a whole different direction, and so they decided to just consolidate 13 into 14, which they were working on contemporaneously, and they just decided to combine it into one.
Well, again, I don't believe that. What I think happened is, based on information that I've been able to get a hold of through the years and through comments from other people who've been involved in investigating UFOs, is that at that point they figured that report number 12 would be the last report they ever issued. And somewhere along the line they made a mistake, and they decided that they needed to produce a report that filled in a certain level of government official on what was really happening. And they entitled it, quite by accident, Blue Book Report 13. And when they realized the mistake that they had made, they jerked it out of the channels immediately, retitled it to Grudge Blue Book 13 because it had Grudge material in it from way back in Project Grudge days before Blue Book had been renamed.
All right, so you get this courier pouch.
Mm-hmm.
It's sealed.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's got all kinds of writing on it that lets you know that this is top secret. What was your clearance at the time?
My clearance at the time was what they call a Crypto 14. 13 or 14, I believe it was. Which essentially meant my clearance was higher than the president's clearance as far as material and information.
Is that possible?
Well, when you consider every 4 years you got this redneck who comes into the office from Texas or Georgia or California or wherever, and considering the sometimes the quality of the presidential candidates, what would you think?
That's the way I would do it. That is the way I would do it. I've often thought about that, but there are people out there who will scoff at that.
Well, I don't think the American public realizes just how limited the president's powers really are. Presidential office is realistically vacated every 4 years. Now, you have a person who will sit in office for 4 years and who literally has his finger on the button. But he's not really doing the job of government. You've got your agencies like the CIA, the DIA, MSI, you know, and then your Labor Department and all those things that are doing the real work of the matter. And realistically, all the president really is a figurehead, because he just doesn't have the time to sit there and do, you know, the work of governing every particular segment of American society, which is not a bad way to do things if you can delegate properly. But if you're not informed of what is in fact going on, and the government or a certain faction of the government says, well, this guy's a clown and he could cause us some real problems, we're not going to tell him about this or that or the other, you know, then you have a real situation where it's possible that these things can happen. Now, you got to bear in mind, too, that President Reagan was in his second term of office when he started his alien speeches.
Mm-hmm. True. All right, let's get back to this document you allegedly saw. Now, it was your job to open up this document, take a look at it, analyze it, and evaluate it as far as credibility.
But it was my job to read the document and analyze what we call the probability factor of factual information. Yeah.
All right. What basically did it contain? What met your eyes when you opened it?
Well, aside from the standard military jar clearance, you know, monitored viewing only, this kind of thing, you know, the special codes that go along with it and that kind of thing. The report itself contained several items. Most notably were a series of photographs, several dozen photographs of things like autopsy reports on alien bodies, photographs of the alien bodies, photographs of technology, recovered disc, and this kind of thing, and tons and tons and tons of technical reports. And there was also a report from Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And that report essentially said, and Hynek's words at the time was that although he had not seen the evidence firsthand, based on what he read, he believed that this was true evidence, and based on the material he had seen. Now, several years later, I bearded Dr. Hynek in his den, so to speak. Hynek and I had both been asked to work as advisors on a production of Barry and Enright's called Strange as It Seems, which was supposed to be a pilot program in answer to That's Incredible. And they had a UFO segment on there, and a fellow by the name of Travis Walton and I went from APRO, and Hynek, unbeknown to me, had been flown out from Illinois at that time and asked to act as you know, an advisor or a speaker on it. Hynek and I were in the green room, and I flat out asked him, I said, you know, what about the report 13? Well, Hynek said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, look, I've seen the report. I saw the report that you wrote and was included in it. And he looked at me and he said, well, you know. I said, well, what gives? And I started to get very angry about it. And he said, look, don't try and involve me in any of your bullshit. Simple fact of the matter is that to this day, I will deny any knowledge of Report 13. And I said, how can you do that? And I'll never forget this as long as I live. He said, who are they going to believe? Me or some shavetail who's been at this for less than a year and who everybody thinks is lying anyway?
So Hynek basically bowed out of that whole...
Is what he did. But you have to bear in mind that Hynek, when Blue Book ended, he issued a statement that said that there were no such things as UFOs or any of this kind of stuff, and then when he was free of government service, did a complete turnaround and started the International Center for UFO Studies.
Right, because he obviously believed that UFOs were real. So why do you suppose he denied 13? What do you think was his motivation? I mean, that would be the ultimate achievement of his ufological career.
Well, I think he denied it for a couple of reasons. The first reason being because he signed the Secrecies Agreement, or the Secrecies Act, which essentially said that he acknowledged the fact that the government had the right to try him without benefit of a public trial, deny him any retirement benefits that he might have had coming, imprison him, or whatever. He had a lot to lose. That and the fact, too, that the information that was in it was pretty incredible to begin with. And he could see what I was encountering at the time. You know, I had people calling me a liar and a pervert and everything else. And they were doing a real good hatchet job on me at that point.
Okay. All right, so you see the document, and what kind of a credibility rating what kind of rating did you assign it?
Well, initially I looked at it and I read it through very carefully, and I thought that this was a joke. I really did think it was a joke until I got to the section of photographs, which I recognized. Those were the photographs of the mutilated bodies in the B-52 that we recovered in Vietnam. I recognized those photographs because I took them.
Okay.
And in the report, it said, essentially, the story behind it is that the last transmission from the aircraft stated that they were under attack from a bright light. And this apparently was repeated 2 or 3 times, and then all communication with the aircraft broke off.
And this is the first you knew that the incident that you had investigated was connected to UFOs.
Right. This was the very first thing, very first time I realized what was going on. Then I started rereading everything, looking at the photographs. I had some photographic experience. I tried to see if they were tricks. I looked at the photographs under a magnifying glass, realizing that there was a possibility that these things could have been manufactured in a good special effects lab. But I saw no sign of it, and based on the other material that I saw in it, and based on those photographs that I saw, I eventually decided that there was a very high probability that the material was true. And at that point, I assigned to it a 98% probability rating of being accurate information.
Okay. So you had possession of the documents for quite some time then, in order to...
Well, I had possession of the documents for about 10 hours.
10 hours.
But I was in a controlled environment, too.
You were allowed to go over it with a magnifying glass?
Yeah.
The kind of thing that they wanted you to do?
Yeah. You have to realize is that when you're in a situation like that where you're looking at secure documents, you're locked into your cubbyhole. There's essentially a guard on where you're at. If you've got to go to the bathroom or anything like that, you call the duty officer. The duty officer comes in with a guard. He takes the documents, locks them away, signs for them on your receipt slip. He leaves the room. You get up, you go do whatever you got to do, go to the bathroom, get a drink. When you're ready, you go back in. You call the duty officer. The duty officer brings the documents back to you. He unlocks them, puts them on your desk. You sign for him. He leaves, locks your door, and the guard goes back on station. And it's a very long, drawn-out process. So if you figure you have to go to the bathroom in about 10 minutes, you better start doing it now, because you're going to wet yourself.
The reason I ask that is because you seem to recall a lot of details about the document. You have the serial number J1327 Delta, inside a publication with red tape, code red security precautions, title, analysis report. I mean, you seem to have the whole thing pretty much committed to memory. Did you do that on purpose?
No, I have a pretty phenomenal memory to a certain extent, and that information at that time was pretty fresh in my mind. 13 years. And I don't remember it as well now as I did then, but I do remember the pertinent facts about it.
When was this dictated? I mean, this came from some notes that you dictated into a cassette recorder, I guess.
Because they were dictated into a cassette recorder.
You did it from memory.
Basically from memory. I returned to the United States the first week of June, and I'm sorry, first week of August. And the date I actually viewed the document was June the 27th, not July the 27th, and I was back in the States about the middle of July. Okay. And August, September, I guess it was about September, Stanton Friedman was giving a speech at Pima Community College here in Tucson on UFOs. And I'd seen the flyers because at that point I was working as a security guard, and one of the duty assignments was out at Pima Community College. And just out of curiosity, I went to Stanton Friedman's speech. And during the course of his speech, Stanton said that there was no such thing as Blue Book Report 13. And after he delivered his speech, I approached him and I said, that's not true. There is a Blue Book 13. I've read it. I've seen it. And with a matter of minutes, Stanton Friedman, Alan Benz, and Jim Lorenzen, who was the head of APRO at the time, and I were on our way over to the APRO offices, where I spent about 3 to 4 hours talking to them while they were recording everything. And then several months later, Wendell Stevens and I talked about it. I transcribed several pages of notes concerning what I saw for Wendell, and I had recorded some cassettes for Wendell also, trying to recall more detail of what I'd seen.
Okay. What was the document dated? I have it here as 1953 to 1963, with the 1963 in parentheses.
Yeah.
Is that the actual way it was on the document?
Right.
Okay. So, to your knowledge, the document then was published when? 63?
That version of the document was, but the document originally started in the 50s, and it had been continually updated and annotated.
Okay. But basically, as far as you know, it was not more recent than 63?
Not at that point, no.
The reason I ask that is because it's, according to your recollection, it mentions close encounters of the first kind, close encounters of the second kind, close encounters of the third kind.
Right.
Are these not classifications that Dr. Hynek came up with in the 70s?
They were originally classifications that were released as being Dr. Hynek's in the 70s, as far as I know, but that was what was in the document.
Okay. So you're saying then that Dr. Hynek had either originated these earlier, or someone else had originated them and he borrowed them?
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay. All right, so now you've seen the document, you're shipped back to the States, okay, in a somewhat of a hurry, I would take it.
I reported to work like I normally do. I dropped the wife off at school and the kids off at the daycare center. I signed into my workstation and was immediately informed that the base commander wanted to see me. And I was escorted to the base commander's office by 2 air security police officers. Well, I had no idea what was going on. And I said, okay, what the hell, you know. So I got up to his office and was promptly informed that I was to wait. And I waited about 30 to 40 minutes, and he finally called me into his office and told me that my services for Air Security Services Command were no longer needed, that I was being returned to the United States. To which I promptly replied, well, technically I'm a dependent husband. Just debrief me, give me my final paycheck, and I'll go home. To which he replied, you are being sent back to the United States. And I said, well, at least let me call my wife down at the school and tell her what's going on. And he said, you are being held incommunicado. You will be immediately taken to RAF Lakenheath and put on a flight back to the United States. Which is what happened. I was put on a flight. They drove me to RAF Lakenheath, and I was put on a MAC flight, handed my final paycheck right then and there, and flown in to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and cut loose. Or the air base by Fort Dix, New Jersey. And so the first thing I did was try to contact my wife on the telephone. When I tried to contact her, I dialed our home phone number in England, and it rang, and then a man's voice answered the phone. Hello, who is this? Well, this is Bill. Is Stephanie there? Click. Hang up. I did this 4 or 5 times then, and then over the period of several months, I must have done it at least 4 or 5 dozen more times. Then I tried to call some of my friends. People that I had been associated with the medieval society over there. That was one of my hobbies, and getting dressed up in armor and going out in the park on weekends. And
Society for Creative Anachronism?
Well, it was similar to the Society for Creative Anachronism, but we used to beat the hell out of each other with swords on the weekends and have a good old time doing it.
Sounds like fun.
So anyway, I tried to contact them. I'd dial their numbers, the phone would ring, a man's voice would answer it, hello, click, hang up on me. And at this point, I was becoming an emotional basket case. I really was. I mean, I was an emotional wreck at that point. You know, all kinds of things go through your head at that point, and UFOs were the furthest thing from my mind. And one of the things was that I thought that my wife was having an affair with somebody who wanted to get me out of there, and who decided that they were just going to fire me and boot me out. And that was a reasonable explanation at the time. I didn't know what else to think, because I certainly wasn't thinking about UFOs or the job that I was doing. I wasn't told that the job I did was poor or anything. In fact, I had received several commendations for the work that I did.
Nobody ever mentioned to you that you were being shipped out because you had seen this stuff?
No.
So that never occurred to you?
It never occurred to me at that point. And eventually, as things got progressively worse, I gave up trying to contact my wife. And I haven't seen my wife or kids in 15 years.
What point did you give up? How many months into this whole scenario?
I guess it was pretty close to 2 years.
2 years.
Before I finally just said, I got to get on with my life. By this time, I had been involuntarily committed to Camino Community Hospital because at one point I tried to commit suicide. At the end of the 2-week period that I was committed, I didn't say anything about UFOs or anything because I really wasn't thinking about that all that much. By this time, I had talked with Stanton Friedman, and I started doing research and everything. And I had discussed the possibility with several people, but at the end of it, after the doctor had interviewed me and several members of my family, he decided that I was the only sane one in the family and cut me loose. Fooled him. But in any event, it was about 2 years.
It's about 2 years?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure you're aware speculation is that this whole thing was confabulated by you as some kind of an excuse or a kind of a defense against
desertion and marital problems and stuff like that. Yeah, well, I understand that, and I'm very familiar with that. And yes, it could be a possibility, but it's not. You know, I'm not saying that my marriage to my wife was absolutely the most perfect marriage in the world. I don't think any marriage is perfect. We had our problems like anybody else, but it was certainly not something that would make me desert my wife and kids.
Okay. Now, flash forward a little bit to where they start to try to get you. This is the part that a lot of people find interesting. All of a sudden,
Well, all of a sudden, I started having some pretty weird experiences. My apartment And I didn't realize this at the time, that it was an actual attempt on my life. I later was able to figure it out. I had gone over to a friend's house to do some leather work for him. And they were going to give me a free meal, and back at that period of time in my life, a free meal was next to getting a bar of gold as far as I was concerned, because it meant survival. So I went over to his house, and we watched television and had dinner. I did the work for him. We sat there and had a nice old evening, and I spent the night over at his house, and he gave me a ride back to my apartment the next day. And when we got there, we found that my apartment had been guttered by fire. Now, Alan Benz of, at that time, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, out of curiosity, got a hold of the official fire inspector's report, which showed that it was, in fact, arson. A firebomb had been dumped in.
That's right. And I've spoken to Alan about that, and he has confirmed that indeed was the case. But wasn't there an incident before that involving like a Lincoln Town car?
I had taken a trip to Sierra Vista to visit my dad to discuss some business. I was trying to start a store that specialized in custom-made leather goods, and I needed to talk to him about helping me find some financing. And I jumped on the back of my motorcycle and was cruising down to Sierra Vista. Now, back in those days, there were certain times of the day when the road was fairly deserted. It's not like it is now with constant traffic or anything like that. Of course, that was back in the dark ages, back when they were still using covered wagons and mules. But anyway, what happened was I was cruising down Interstate 10, and there was a black car that was like a limousine. And I figured, yeah, I would call it a Lincoln Town car because that's what it looked like. But it started pacing me through the traffic. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it sped up. And it kept pretty equal distance the whole way. And I guess about 10 miles this side of the Sierra Vista turnoff, we hit a stretch of road where there was no oncoming traffic. And he started speeding up. And I happened to see it happen to the back of my rearview mirror. And having ridden motorcycles for quite some time, and having had people, take advantage of the fact that I was on a motorcycle, I sort of instinctively pulled as far to the right as I possibly could, thinking this individual would pass me. Well, as I pulled over, it pulled over. It kept me in a direct line right between its headlights. And it occurred to me that something wasn't right here. So it accelerated, it came up after me, and just as it was about maybe 10 or 15 yards away from me, I swerved to the left, and it came shooting right by me where I would have been. Went on down the road.
You swerved to the left?
I swerved to the left toward the middle lane.
Okay.
No, I was in the right lane at this point.
Okay. So you swerve over to the left.
Yeah.
And it goes shooting on by you.
It goes shooting on by me. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, okay, he's going to keep going. All of a sudden, he slammed on the brakes, did a 180, swung that thing around, and started coming back at me again. At this point, it occurred to me that they were kind of serious about this. So I cut off into the desert, and they tried to follow me into the desert, and they got about 20 or 30 yards into the desert before the car started to bog down in the soft dirt. And I stayed in the desert all the way towards Sierra Vista. I just sort of cut a diagonal path toward the Sierra Vista and wound up coming out on the road toward Huachuca City. And I rode on in Sierra Vista and told my dad what happened. Of course, my father poo-pooed and said, it's all in your imagination and all this kind of thing. And but he agreed to follow me back to Tucson, and we made it back to Tucson, and then shortly after that, the fire incident took place at the apartment.
Okay. And then there was another incident that took place in Virginia where they supposedly you tripped over some cords or something, fell on your face, and all of a sudden, gunfire, automatic gunfire through your window. Is that right?
Well, you got to bear in mind too that between then and that time, there were several other attempts on my life.
Okay,
People,
15
total of 15 attempts. And realistically, some of them could have been legitimate accidents, but at this point, I choose not to think that because there were just too many of them. People had tried to run me over on the street, run me off the road, this kind of thing. But the incident you're referring to, I had just divorced my second wife, who deserted me, as the saucer spins. And I was living in a town called Crewe, Virginia, and I was renting a house which was just, I guess, a block and a half down from the local police station. I was in pretty sorry shape emotionally at that time also. Seems to be the story of my life. But because, you know, it was pretty traumatic having a wife walk out on you. You know, I don't know if you've ever had that happen, but you know, it's a big.
I better never have it happen.
It's been, you know, it's a big change in your life. You know, a big sudden traumatic change. And I was moping around the house, and I was watching a baseball game. It must have been about 7, 8 o'clock at night, and I'd gone into the kitchen to get a can of soda. Came back in the living room, and in actuality, what I did was I bent over to tie my shoelace from the sneakers I was wearing. And I tripped as I was going over and landed flat on my face. And just as that happened, machine gun fire, automatic weapons fire, started cutting the front of the house, through the front of the house. And I rolled toward a brick retaining wall, which I guess was about 4 feet high, and then it was wood construction from the rest of it up. And just rolled toward the wall, and it scared me so badly, I literally wet myself. I didn't know what was going on at that point. And anyway, it seemed like it lasted forever, and it couldn't have been more than maybe 5 or 6 minutes of this. But when it stopped, I mean, my ears were ringing, and I heard what I thought was a car squealing off. Well, it took the local police department, which was just around the corner from my house, a half hour to get there. And when they got there, the Nottoway County Sheriff's Department was there, the police department, and the Virginia State Police. And ultimately, they decided that there must have been a total of approximately 15,000 rounds emptied into the house.
15,000?
15,000 rounds.
So obviously this case was investigated.
Oh, yeah, it was investigated, and they thought initially that it was my father-in-law, who was ex-Army officer, who decided that he was going to settle a score with me that I had no idea was going on, other than the fact that...
Having to do with the wife that
yeah,
was deserted, right?
Yeah.
But they never were able to pin it on.
They weren't able to pin it on anyone, really, and they just sort of left it as an unsolved case. Of course, I was working for a radio station at the time, and I was a public figure in a local community, and I had a fairly controversial show.
Okay, so it's possible then that in that particular case, for instance...
In that particular case, it could have been anything or anyone.
Some maniac with a gun.
Yeah.
Okay, but bottom line, you think that most of these attempts have been, what, signals to you?
Either an attempt to silence me or to motivate me into certain directions, I believe.
By whom?
I don't know.
Speculate.
The government.
Okay. Then that leads to the next question. Wouldn't it be more wouldn't it behoove them more to just leave you alone? and not attract attention, not get your mind going in the direction of, hey, I may be onto something because somebody's trying to kill me.
Unless, of course, they want me to go into a certain direction and do certain things.
It's a hell of a way to tell you.
Well, when I'm left alone, at this point in recent years, I haven't gotten involved in UFOs. In fact, when I was in Virginia, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with them.
Okay, but in recent years, you've started Ufinet?
You're
speaking here in Tucson.
I've started Ufinet. I've become involved very publicly in the UFO research and investigations.
Anybody tried to kill you recently?
No, not recently.
When was the last attempt? Was that the one in Virginia?
No, there was one more attempt 2 weeks prior to the conference that took place in 1989 at Las Vegas, Nevada. I believe it was an attempt. I had a butane tank in my front yard of the trailer where I live explode. The tank had just been installed. It had just been tested by the butane company, and it had been certified as being secure. And when it exploded, it took out my car, 2 storage sheds, and burnt the living hell out of the front lawn. I ultimately went digging through the ashes and found what I thought to be some sort of detonator, or a piece of some sort of detonator. Whether it was or not, I've got no way of telling. But since the conference has taken place in 1989, it's been very quiet. I haven't had any problems. I've been very busy with Ufinet and doing the work that I've been doing and gathering information.
Tell me about Ufinet. What exactly are you trying to accomplish with Ufinet? What is the structure? What is it?
Well, Ufinet is an anachronism for UFO Information Network. And the whole idea behind Ufinet was to be able to open a place or create a situation where there could be a repository of information from all individuals and organizations that deal in UFOs, and make that information available to all organizations without getting involved in the internal politics of each organization, without issuing a pronouncement on whether a case is valid or invalid, but to be able to essentially provide a place for legitimate investigators and organizations to come to and find information they needed that might possibly fill in a gap on a case that they're investigating, or for them to provide information that will help another investigator fill in a gap for a case that he or she might be investigating. The principle behind Ufinet was to be able to establish a situation based on facts, not speculation, but facts. That was the original idea. But during the course of the last year, we've discovered that there are other areas within ufology that need to be delved into more than they have in the past. A good example is paranormal activity and its relationship to abductees and contactees. Now, for a period of time in the past, we looked upon abductees and contactees as being screwballs. Any serious research or investigation in this area was sort of frowned upon because we had no real way of proving that it happened. That's since changed. We've been able to establish that these things do indeed happen. There is some physical evidence that we've been able to see.
We've established that something happened.
Yeah.
Whether it is
as an abduction or contact, we don't know for sure. I mean, we have no real way of definitely saying, short of trotting out the alien themselves or filming them abducting someone. But here we get into a shadowy area, and that involves paranormal activity. Through the years, we've discovered that most contactees, people who've not had contact with each other, tell usually the same story in various different forms of either dreaming about being carried aboard an alien spacecraft, having medical tests performed on him. And it wasn't until Betty and Barney Hill came out, and their case was so well documented and researched by medical authorities and psychological authorities, that the tide suddenly began to shift in favor of acceptance of the abduction contactee scenario. And since then, more and more evidence has come out which supports the possibility that this has happened. But there is an area which has been totally ignored, and that is paranormal phenomena. I'm talking about things like poltergeist activity, precognition, balls of light floating through the room, books flying through the air, psychokinetic incidences, and this kind of thing. And surprisingly enough, recently, in performing research and going through old records of Dr. Leo Sprinkle, talking to people from all over the country, information that was gained from Paranet, we've discovered that there is a correlation of paranormal activity that goes back as far as 1963 of recorded incidents of this happening. And this is an area I think that we have to learn to look at a little bit more carefully without the prejudice that we have with regards to the dividing line between UFOs and psychic phenomena, because the research that I've done indicates that it's possible that they're interconnected.
Okay. How are we doing on time? What time is it right now?
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock? Okay.
Yeah.
Just two real quick questions, both of them free association time. I'm going to shoot a name at you. What's your reaction?
All right.
John Lear.
John Lear is a friend. I support his research. I respect him. I do not necessarily agree with him on a lot of what he says, but only because, from my own point of view, I need to see more before I can form an honest and legitimate opinion.
Okay. Bill Cooper. And try to control yourself. We're on tape.
Bill Cooper and I do not agree on anything. And that's all I'm going to say at this point about Bill Cooper.
Fair enough. Well, I think that about covers it. I want to thank you for your time, spending this time with us, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
And we'll be at the conference tomorrow.
Hope to see you there.
See you then.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.